Alright, and welcome to the book review report for Isaac Asimov's Robot Dreams. Robot Dreams is a collection of short stories by Isaac Asimov, and stories are semi-related to each other, and by semi-related I mean the fact that the stories sometimes carry over a character, or they might carry over one of the machines that's been introduced or robots that's been introduced in the previous stories. However, the stories do not really continue on, like they do not, you don't need to read one before to read the another one. That's why I say they're semi-related, and partially because not all stories are related to each other. Now, I found this collection of stories very interesting and engaging to read. The main reason is the main reasons for me were the themes that were presented in the stories and the philosophical questions that the author is discussing in the stories themselves. And the philosophical questions are very well presented in the way they are presented, is that they're not really answered all the time, and I'll talk about that more later. So the audience for this stories is not the audience that's looking for space opera, or the audience that's looking for lots of action in the stories. It's more audience that's interested in philosophical ideas, and I'm going to be saying philosophical ideas a lot because this is predominantly what all these short stories are based around. Now, as I mentioned, the way the discussions are done is that the reader participates in discussions, the reader is engaged in the stories, and the way what happens is basically the reader is forced to, at some point, to acknowledge the philosophical question that's being presented and say, yes, I agree with the other, or I disagree with the other, or sometimes the other does not even give the solution, and therefore the reader is forced to say, okay, I think this is the answer to this question. And of course, as the reader is doing that, the reader is running through the arguments in his head, and that's, I guess, one of the amazing things about the stories, is that they force the person reading them to argue with the author or argue with themselves in their head, thinking through the reasons why they believe this and not the other way around. Now, let's look at the narrative itself and the stories, and I'm not going to discuss each story in each story's narrative in it. I just rather will go overall how I found the stories, and the overall ideas in the stories are well represented, and the pacing is done at a very good pace. I never really felt like, well, I did feel once that the story was not progressing as fast as it should be. That was in The Ugly Little Boy, where I felt it was a bit slower, but that would be maybe my own preference. Overall, the Ugly Little Boy, the story itself, I think there was a reason for that progression in order to create more understandable characters and more relatable characters, to understand what and how they are, not what, but yeah, what actually motivates them and how they actually make their decisions. Now, the narrative itself is not science focused. Again, I'm going to say it's a philosophical ideas focus. The science is actually dated in the books, in these short stories. Now, the science was up to date when the stories were written, but as we're progressing and the stories are getting older, of course, the science gets more dated, and the author actually acknowledges that in his introduction to the stories, saying that yes, that was the case. In some cases, the author points out that it might have happened next year after he finished writing the story, that some new data rendered some things that he's describing incorrect. But overall, if there's any scientific concepts involved, the author provides enough background for a person to reading these concepts to understand them and to follow them in the story enough to understand the actual themes and questions being posed by the actual narrative. Now, there's a lot of themes in this stories. Again, I'm not gonna go story by story and talk about each theme there. I would actually say that there are generally the themes involved around what is meant to be human, what is meant to be intelligence, what is meant to have intelligence that we as humans will recognize equal to our own, and when something goes from being like a pet style type of thing, intelligent enough to be treated as a pet, to something that we become suddenly afraid of because it seems to be that pet is becoming equal to us in intelligence. Another one of the themes that plays out quite well is the idea of reliance on computers to do our decision making for us, and what is possible or not possible, and what kind of extremes it could lead to. Now, there are also a number of themes that talk about ethics, human ethics, and of course about some of the themes that they do concern about is mental states or mental abnormalities. That in this another interesting themes are presented in terms of what different mental states mean and what different mental abnormalities could contribute in their way, and if correcting those abnormalities could be actually problematic or destructive. The theme that I really liked the most was the political change theme, and it talked about the ideas whether the political change should happen gradually or should it go through a revolution, and that's is done for one of the stories in the actual book in the book, and it talks about saying that here's the two choices, and this is one of those stories that does not present a clear choice, saying that, well, which one is it that you think is the best one? And that's what I'd like to say, is that there's a lot of stories that end this open philosophical question where no answer is really given, or the answer that is presented is not given as the best possible choice, leaving the reader to make up their own idea on what should be the proper answer to this question. Now, there was no literary devices that really jumped out at me and that contributed to engagement. Overall, I found that the themes and the narrative itself was engaging enough, and there was no real need for me to actually have these literary devices that add to that engagement. Writing style wise, I would say that writing is not extremely descriptive. Isaac Asimov does not read that a lot of description, because he kind of leaves it open to the reader to picture the world. He does provide description in those sections that are necessary to create the narrative structure, not the narrative structure, but to create the descriptive structure of the image that's necessary to move the narrative, but nothing more. So in other words, the writing style is very conservative, but it doesn't really impact the enjoyment of the actual book. The reading style for this book, well, it's very suited to short bursts of reading because it's a short stories. There are some longer stories, and some stories are engaging, so it would be they're engaging in such a way that it would be hard to put down the book and say, okay, I'll finish this off later. No, sometimes the reader will feel like, oh no, I want to finish off right now, because the action or the story itself pulls the reader in that much, which is a good thing. So overall, I would say that these short stories are engaging and interesting to read, and what really grabbed me were the philosophical themes in each. I would emphasize that again, in each story there's a very deep philosophical theme presented.